The base had been quiet for 11 minutes before the siren started. 11 minutes of the kind of quiet that does not exist in peacetime. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of held breath. The kind of quiet that accumulates when every person on a forward-deployed installation in western Iraq has read the same intelligence summary, absorbed the same threat assessment, and arrived independently at the same conclusion: that the escalation cycle that began on February 28th with the strikes on Iran had not yet produced its full regional consequence, and that the forward bases scattered across Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf were the most accessible variables in the equation that Tehran's surviving military command was still working to solve. At 4:09 a.m., the AN/TPY-2 Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Radar, positioned on a hardened pad at the eastern perimeter of the installation, resolved the first ballistic track, then a second. Then, in the 15 seconds that followed, 7 more. 9 inbound ballistic missile tracks, bearing from the east-northeast on trajectories consistent with launch points in the western Zagros highlands of Iran, approximately 380 kilometers distant. The missiles were in mid-course phase. The radar's discrimination algorithms processed the track data and produced a probability assessment. 6 of the 9 tracks were assessed as medium-range ballistic variants, conventional warhead, CEP, approximately 50 meters. The remaining 3 carried signatures consistent with a maneuvering re-entry capability, a terminal phase guidance correction that complicated the intercept geometry for the Patriot batteries deployed in the base's layered defensive architecture. The officer in the Tactical Operations Center did not wait for confirmation. The base's mass notification system activated at 4:09:44 a.m. with a tone that had a specific quality, not an alarm in the conventional sense, but a sound calibrated to penetrate sleep and produce immediate orientation. Every person on the installation who was not already awake became awake in approximately 3 seconds. Those who had been awake, the watch teams, the radar operators, the Patriot battery crews already at their stations, were already moving. The base housed approximately 2,400 U.S. and coalition personnel. It contained aircraft maintenance facilities, intelligence processing infrastructure, logistics staging areas, and the regional coordination hub for air operations across the Western Iraq theater. It was, in the language of military targeting doctrine, a high-value node, a concentration of capability and personnel that represented a meaningful degradation to the coalition's operational capacity, if it could be damaged or destroyed. That calculation had been made somewhere in Iran's surviving military command structure, in whatever hardened facility had not been reached by the strikes of the past 12 days, by officers who had watched their chain of command decapitated and their air defense networks methodically dismantled, and who were now working from the logic that if they could not defend what they had, they could at minimum impose cost on what the coalition was trying to do. 9 ballistic missiles was not a symbolic gesture. 9 ballistic missiles, correctly targeted against a base of this size and configuration, represented a genuine capability to produce mass casualties and destroy irreplaceable infrastructure. The mathematical problem for the defensive systems was not whether the Patriot batteries could engage 9 inbound tracks in principle. The mathematical problem was whether the specific battery deployment, the specific interceptor inventory, and the specific engagement geometry could produce successful intercepts against all 9, including the 3 maneuvering variants, within the available timeline. The answer to that question was not yet known at 4:09 a.m. The Patriot battery commanders received the engagement authorization at 4:10 and 12 seconds a.m. 2 PAC-3 batteries were active on the installation's defensive perimeter, positioned to provide overlapping coverage across the primary threat axes identified in the installation's force protection plan. A 3rd battery, operated by a coalition partner nation, covered the northern sector. The engagement authority was divided by sector, with each battery responsible for the tracks, bearing within its assigned coverage arc. The first Patriot PAC-3 interceptors launched at 4:10:31 a.m. The launch signature of a Patriot interceptor is not subtle. The rocket motor ignition produces a pressure signature that the entire installation registered simultaneously, a deep, resonant concussion that vibrated the prefabricated walls of every structure on the base, that rattled equipment on workbench surfaces and caused unsecured items to shift, that produced in every person present the specific physical sensation, of a large explosive event occurring nearby, not the enemy. The defense. The first indication that the defensive engagement was underway was a sound that, to someone without context, was indistinguishable from an incoming impact. 3 interceptors went up in the first salvo, then 2 more from the second battery. The sky above the base, which had been uniformly dark at 4:10 a.m., began to change. The rocket plumes were visible from the ground, bright, fast-moving points of light climbing steeply, leaving white smoke trails that caught the light of their own exhaust and traced the geometry of the engagement envelope across the darkness in lines that bent and curved as the interceptors' guidance systems made continuous course corrections in pursuit of their targets. In the Tactical Operations Center, the radar picture told the story in real time. The tracks of the incoming missiles and the tracks of the interceptors converged on the display at speeds that compressed the available decision time to a scale where the watch team's role had largely transitioned from active control to monitoring. The automated engagement sequencing was executing. The humans in the loop were watching, verifying, ready to intervene if the system's logic diverged from tactical reality, but fundamentally observing a process that was moving faster than directed human action could meaningfully influence. The first intercept registered at 4:11:08 a.m. A PAC-3 round met an incoming ballistic track at approximately 45 kilometers altitude and 140 kilometers downrange. The radar return collapsed from a coherent track to a debris scatter pattern that dispersed over the following 12 seconds. 1 down. The second and third intercepts followed within 40 seconds. Each one a clean engagement against the conventional warhead variants that flew predictable terminal trajectories. The debris from the second intercept produced a brief, bright flash visible from the base perimeter, a thermal event at high altitude that the personnel on the ground saw as a momentary star, something out of place in the black sky, something that indicated an event of enormous energy occurring at a range that made it beautiful, rather than terrifying. Then the system flagged the maneuvering tracks. All 3 of the maneuvering re-entry variants had initiated their terminal guidance corrections simultaneously at 4:11:40 a.m., at an altitude that placed them below the engagement ceiling of the long-range intercept geometry, and inside the compressed timeline that the PC-3's mid-course guidance update interval was designed to handle. But barely. The maneuvers were not identical. 2 of the 3 executed lateral offsets of approximately 300 meters, moving their predicted impact points away from the pre-calculated intercept solutions that the Patriot batteries had been preparing. The third executed a depressed trajectory alteration, a dive maneuver that increased its terminal velocity while simultaneously lowering its altitude faster than the predicted profile, compressing the remaining intercept timeline by 11 seconds. The battery fire control officers issued manual engagement authority overrides at 4:11:52 a.m., authorizing the system to allocate additional interceptors against the 3 maneuvering tracks beyond the standard 2-round allocation. The tactical calculation was stark. Spend more interceptors now in the engagement window where a kill was still achievable, or preserve inventory and accept a reduced probability of intercept. The officers chose to spend. 3 additional PAC-3 rounds launched in rapid succession. The Tactical Operations Center radar screen showed 6 interceptor tracks simultaneously pursuing 3 maneuvering targets, a display that had the appearance of controlled chaos, but was, in fact, the execution of a doctrine that had been refined over 2 decades of engagement analysis. The first maneuvering track was intercepted at 4:12:19 a.m., approximately 28 kilometers from the installation. The engagement required 2 PAC-3 rounds, the first achieving a close proximity detonation that damaged but did not fully neutralize the incoming warhead, the second completing the kill. The debris from the partially damaged warhead impacted open desert terrain, approximately 18 kilometers northeast of the base perimeter. No personnel in that area. The second maneuvering track was intercepted at 4:12:44 a.m. Clean single-round kill. The debris pattern was assessed as no threat to the installation. The third maneuvering track, the one with a depressed trajectory, the one that had compressed the intercept timeline, was the problem. The PAC-3 round allocated against it, executed its mid-course correction, and acquired the target's revised track. The intercept geometry was marginal, achievable within the system's parameters, but requiring the interceptor to execute a terminal maneuver at near maximum lateral acceleration to match the target's updated trajectory. The guidance system made the calculation. The interceptor executed the maneuver. The intercept occurred at 4:12:58 a.m. at 9.4 kilometers from the installation perimeter, at an altitude of approximately 2,200 meters. At this range, the intercept was no longer an abstract event on a radar display. It was a physical reality that the installation experienced directly. The detonation, the PAC-3 hit-to-kill warhead meeting the incoming ballistic warhead at closing speeds in excess of Mach 4, produced a concussive event visible and audible to every person on the base. The flash was brief and total, a white point that briefly turned the pre-dawn sky into something resembling noon. The sound arrived approximately 27 seconds later as a sharp, flat crack that rolled across the installation from the northeast and produced a physical sensation in the chest that was unlike the launch signatures of the Patriot interceptors. Higher pitched, more abrupt, less sustained. The debris trajectory analysis would later assess that fragments from the intercept event impacted the base's northeastern perimeter zone. Most of the debris dispersed at altitude and lost kinetic energy before reaching the surface. But some fragments retained enough velocity to reach the ground inside the perimeter. A radar maintenance team that had been positioned in an open hardstand area in the northeastern sector, 4 personnel conducting post-launch system checks on an antenna assembly. Watts Insanoi Cheater Sia Danel Sidericher Daparo Pad on ice. The base emergency response was already activated. The medical team reached the hardstand at 4:14 a.m. All 4 personnel were alive. 2 were uninjured. 1 had sustained fragment impacts to the shoulder and upper arm, deep lacerations, significant soft tissue damage, requiring immediate surgical intervention. The 4th had been struck in the lower leg by a larger debris fragment, sustaining a fracture that would require evacuation to a higher-level medical facility. In the Tactical Operations Center, the radar picture showed 6 of 9 tracks eliminated. 3 conventional ballistic tracks remained. They had not been assigned initial intercept solutions in the first engagement wave because the battery engagement sequencing had prioritized the maneuvering variants as the highest threat tracks. The 3 remaining inbound missiles were in terminal phase, bearing on their original trajectories without maneuver, and they were inside the terminal engagement envelope at 4:13 a.m. The coalition partner battery in the northern sector had been tracking these 3 residual tracks since the engagement began. The battery commander had been holding his fires, working within his assigned sector authority, watching the PAC-3 batteries work the priority threats. When it became clear at 4:12:50 a.m. that the 3 conventional tracks were going to survive the first engagement wave without being addressed, the battery commander requested immediate transfer of engagement authority. It was granted at 4:13 and 2 seconds a.m. 3 interceptors launched within 6 seconds of authorization. The engagements were executed against targets now inside 35 kilometers, at terminal velocities that left minimal margin for error. The first intercept was successful. The second was successful. The third interceptor achieved a proximity detonation. Not a direct hit, but close enough to damage the incoming warhead's fusing system. The warhead tumbled. A tumbling ballistic warhead at terminal velocity is not a precise weapon. It became a large, fast-moving piece of metal falling on a changed trajectory toward the installation's southern perimeter. The base's southern perimeter was the location of the vehicle maintenance compound. Hardened structures, concrete revetments, heavy equipment. The tumbling warhead impacted inside the compound at 4:13:28 a.m. with enough remaining kinetic energy to produce a crater approximately 4 meters in diameter and to collapse the roof structure of a maintenance bay covering an area of roughly 200 square meters. The bay had been evacuated when the mass notification system activated at 4:09 a.m. 3 vehicles inside the bay were destroyed. The structural damage to the bay was extensive. No personnel were in the impact area. The Tactical Operations Center radar display was clear at 4:13:30 a.m. 9 inbound ballistic missiles. Three categories of threat: conventional terminal, maneuvering re-entry, and high-velocity terminal depression. 21 minutes from first radar contact to final impact event. 8 of 9 warheads intercepted before reaching the installation perimeter. 1 warhead reaching the perimeter in degraded, tumbling condition, impacting a hardened compound that had been evacuated in accordance with the mass notification protocol. 2 personnel requiring surgical evacuation. 0 fatalities. 3 vehicles destroyed. 1 maintenance structure collapsed. The installation's operational infrastructure, the aircraft, the intelligence systems, the communications nodes, the fuel and ammunition logistics chain. Intact or one tight and functional, but the accounting did not stop there. The Patriot battery inventory had been reduced by a number that the installation's logistics officer entered into the resupply request system at 4:17 a.m. with a priority classification that reflected the reality that the installation was now operating with a degraded intercept capacity in an active threat environment, where a follow-on attack was not merely possible, but tactically rational for an adversary who had just observed the defensive expenditure in real time. Satellite systems were watching. Intelligence networks were collecting. Somewhere in a hardened facility, officers who had launched 9 ballistic missiles were receiving a damage assessment that told them the installation still stood, and they were weighing the cost-benefit calculation of a second wave against a target that had just spent a significant portion of its defensive inventory. The installation commander convened a threat reassessment at 4:20 a.m. The intelligence officer presented an updated probability model for a follow-on attack within the next 6 hours. The maintenance officer presented the structural damage assessment. The medical officer presented the casualty status. The logistics officer presented the interceptor resupply timeline. None of the information in those 4 briefings was reassuring. All of it was essential. The installation did not stand down from Condition 1. The personnel who had been sheltering in hardened structures returned to their duty stations with the specific kind of awareness that settles into people who have just survived an event they could not fully control. A heightened attention, a recalibration of threat perception, a simultaneous sense of relief at being alive, and clarity about the provisional nature of that condition in this environment. The soldier with the shoulder and arm fragments was already in surgery. The one with the fractured leg was aboard the medevac helicopter at 4:31 a.m., heading for a higher-level medical facility. They were the cost of the margin, the 2 people whose bodies had absorbed what the intercept system had not fully stopped. The maintenance bay in the southern compound was still smoking at dawn. The concrete dust from the collapsed roof had settled on the vehicles that had survived, on the hard stand surface, on the equipment stored in the adjacent revetments. The crater was a clean, round depression that would take a ground crew most of the day to remediate to a condition where the compound could resume operations. At 6 a.m., the daily intelligence summary arrived in the Tactical Operations Center. It contained updated assessments of remaining Iranian ballistic missile inventory, probable launch sites, and projected attack timelines. It contained imagery from overhead assets showing the installation's impact area. It contained a paragraph noting that signals intelligence had detected communications consistent with post-attack assessment activity at an identified Iranian military coordination node. They were reviewing what they had done. They were deciding what to do next. The watch team read the summary, acknowledged it, updated the threat matrix, and continued. Because that is what forward-deployed personnel do in a threat environment that does not offer the option of waiting for certainty. They operate on partial information, in degraded conditions, with depleted resources, in the knowledge that the adversary is also assessing and also deciding, and that the outcome of the next engagement will depend as much on the decisions made in the next 6 hours as on the technology that sat on the perimeter and the humans who operated it. The sky above western Iraq was fully light by 6:30 a.m., though pale, flat, the color of concrete. The craters were visible from the observation post. The smoke from the maintenance compound had cleared to a thin residue. The installation looked, from a distance, largely intact. Because it largely was. Because the system had largely worked. Because the people who maintained and operated that system had trained for exactly this, and had executed under conditions that no training fully replicates. There is no clean victory in a war of attrition. There is surviving this engagement well enough to be present for the next one. There is maintaining the margin of interceptors, of infrastructure, of people, that makes survival of the next engagement possible. There is the understanding carried by every person on that installation when the sun came up over the Iraqi desert on the morning after, that they were still here because a sequence of machines and humans and decisions had worked in alignment at speeds and pressures that left no room for failure. They were still here. The work was not finished. What holds a forward position is not concrete and interceptors. It is the people who refuse to let the calculation close against them. Engagement after engagement, dawn after dawn,